Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Freud's Funky Findings podcast. In this episode, our goal will be to get acquainted with an area of psychology that I personally feared the most before embarking on this journey to become a professional mindpeeper: biological psychology. That's right. After having made it my personality during high school that natural sciences bore me because they have nothing to do with society, here I am begging my pardon, trying to grasp the biology of the most complex organ in the human body. And the worst part is, I selected this college major for myself, so I really have no one to blame this unfortunate turn of events on but myself. Anyway, I'm aware I haven't been the best marketer for biological psychology for like the past minute, so let me try to raise your interest by establishing why biology can't just stay the hell out of psychology in the first place. So there's this one guy, more specifically David Guy Myers, who uses the phrase everything psychological is biological in his book, The Psychology of the Mind, from back in 2009. It refers to the idea that the human psyche cannot be separated from our physical being. Every experience and piece of knowledge we obtain has to be perceived first, which happens through our senses and our nervous system. The emotions that we feel can be explained by specific hormones and neurotransmitters chasing each other around inside the body. And there's a multitude of complex biochemical reactions that form the thoughts, intuitions, and motivations that govern our day to day actions. So, a crucial component to understanding our psychology is also looking at underlying biological mechanisms that have shaped humans over the course of our evolution. Yes, we need to go that far back because even if the environment we live in now doesn't exactly remind us of that, we are, in fact, a small part of a global ecosystem in which we've had to adapt to the conditions around us, just like any other species. Which might actually be a humbling thought at first, to think of ourselves as just another animal whose behavior is kind of the result of our ancient survival strategies, no matter if we're actually like fleeing from bears in Transylvania, like in my family tradition, or following the Bitcoin stream on your smartwatch. So, long story short, biology can provide explanations for psychological phenomena on a different level. Like, you could just say that you feel nervous, describing your state in psychological terms like any normal person, or you could say that your amygdala has perceived a threat, triggering the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, if you want to be an absolute rock star. So, to start off our journey into the cerebrum, today we'll have a first look at 1, the causality between emotion and physical arousal, and 2, the discovery and differentiation between brain areas using the example of our speech centers. Okay, to come to our first topic, let's dive into a question that's been a topic of scientific discussion for quite some time. Does physical arousal cause emotions or emotional perception, or do emotions cause physical arousal? So basically, like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? To illustrate this spicy dispute, let me wrap through a couple of interesting studies. So, first, William James, an American psychologist of the late 1900s, proposed that physical reactions are the starting point for emotional experiences. According to his theory, we feel sad because we cry. The emotion is created when we perceive our body's natural reaction to a certain situation. A quite original study that also points in this direction is the suspension bridge experiment of Arthur Aaron and Donald Dutton, which demonstrated that physiological arousal can influence the perception of emotions. In this experiment, several men were instructed to cross a shaky suspension bridge, because who wouldn't do that in the name of science? And then, towards the middle of this bizarre, fragile bridge, they met an attractive young woman, asking them to fill out a psychological questionnaire, as they always tend to on these kinds of bridges. And another group of men were asked to cross a stable, sturdier bridge and met the same woman towards the middle. After filling out the questionnaires, the eye candy gave both groups of men her phone number, saying that she'd just love to explain the research she's doing with her little questionnaire. What Dutton and Aaron found is that more men who met her crossing the sketchy bridge called her after the experiment compared to the men who crossed the lame old stable bridge. How do we explain this? Well, apparently, when people cross a sketchy suspension bridge, they tend to freak the hell out. Their heart starts pounding, they start to breathe irregularly, adrenaline and cortisol production sets off, meaning physical arousal. What the result of this experiment suggests is that physical arousal from an external circumstance, like a stressful situation, can be misattributed to romantic or sexual attraction, so emotion, indicating that changes in our bodily state can cause our emotional reactions. In contrast, Charles Sherrington's study from the year 1900 had demonstrated that, for example, dogs continued to show normal emotional reactions such as excitement or fear, even after their spinal cords were severed. This finding suggested that the physical feedback from the body normally transmitted through the spinal cord to the brain was not necessary for the experience or expression of emotion. Furthermore, in 2008, Erica Johnson investigated the role of different brain regions in emotional experience using music. Participants with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a part of the front of the brain just above the eyes, continued to report feeling emotion when listening to music, but showed reduced physiological responses. The latter were measured via skin conductance, which is a test of how much the skin is able to lead electricity, which tends to change when we sweat and the body is aroused. On the other hand, participants with damage to the right somatosensory cortex, located in the top middle part of the right hemisphere, displayed normal skin conductance responses, so normal physical reactions, but reported that they no longer felt a subjective emotional experience. The vibes were not vibing, or whatever the kids say these days. And so these findings demonstrate a so called double dissociation, meaning that damage to one brain area only affects one function but not another, and damage to a different brain area affects only the opposite function. Basically, it's evidence that if the area for physical reactions doesn't work, the one for emotional reactions still can, and vice versa, because they're two independent systems. So that's what you call double dissociation. It's like mutual independence, basically. In a nutshell, studies on this topic have been contradictory, but there's a theory that's been holding up almost as well as that one ancient hair tie of mine that I ripped and retied about 3,000 times, the Cannon-Barth theory from 1927. It proposed that emotions and physiological reactions occur simultaneously rather than one causing the other. According to this theory, when a person perceives an emotional stimulus, such as seeing a snake, the brain generates the feeling of fear at the same time it triggers bodily responses like a racing heart or tense muscles. And this challenged the earlier James's idea that emotions arise solely from physical reactions. Today, the leading view in psychology builds on this idea with an interactionist perspective. So, emotions result from continuous interaction between the brain and the body. The brain generates emotional experiences whilst simultaneously integrating signals from the body, such as heart rate, breathing, and skin conductance, which can influence how the emotion is felt. So basically, kind of like a vicious circle. And this dynamic interaction between brain and body is supported by neuroscience and interoception research and is considered the dominant framework for understanding emotions today. Amazing. If you want, take a breath, or I guess you kind of have to, but that was some basic knowledge about the causality between emotion and bodily reaction. Now, let's move on to the discovery and differentiation of brain areas. So, this whole extravaganza started off with the German neuroanatomist Corbinian Brodmann back in the year 1909. Brodmann examined 5 human brains and identified 52 distinct cortical fields, so areas of the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain, made up of folded gray matter. Delicious. His classification was based on differences in the cytoarchitecture, that is, the structure, organization, and layering of nerve cells or neurons in various parts of the cortex. So basically, he looked at how the cells in different parts of the brain differ and tried to create borders between them based on this information. And remarkably, one, because the man sampled 5 brains in total, and two, because this happened almost 120 years ago, many of these regions still correspond to what we understand today as functionally distinct brain areas. Modern brain imaging is dominated by so called multimodal parcellation techniques, which just means that various types of data are all integrated into the monitoring of the brain. For example, genetic data, MRI findings, diffusion MRI findings, which measures the motion of water molecules passing through brain tissue. So you have various techniques and you take and compare results from all of them, hence the term multimodal. With these techniques, scientists have now identified around 180 cortical areas, greatly expanding the model of the 52 Brodmann areas. Okay, so Brodmann discovered various different parts of the brain, but how did we find out what their functions are? Well, you know the saying, you only appreciate the things you have once they're gone. That's pretty much the way the first discoveries about brain functions in different brain regions were made. Let me introduce you to Tan, who was a famous patient of French neurologist Paul Broca in the late 1900s. Tan was certainly a man of few words, but when he spoke, he sure caused some head scratches. Broca's patient, actually named Leborgne, was in fact only able to speak one single syllable clearly, this being Tan. Despite his major speech impairment, Leborgne's speech apparatus, so his voice production, and his fine motor control were intact, and he was even able to sing certain melodies. Furthermore, he could understand speech as he followed Broca's instructions, but just couldn't execute any orders that had to do with expressing himself in words. Though seemingly familiar with how to hold a pen, he couldn't even write. The mystery continued for a short while until one day Don finally spoke his last words. One could only wonder what they were, and took the rest of his wisdom to the grave with him. After his death in 1861, Broca examined Don's brain and discovered a large lesion, so an injury or defect of the brain is generally called a lesion, in the posterior part of the frontal lobe, basically the front left side of the brain, now known as the Broca area. This finding led the neurologist to describe what is now called Broca's aphasia, a disorder causing difficulties in speech production despite preserved comprehension. Aphasia generally refers to any kind of speech related disorder. Importantly, this was one of the first demonstrations that specific cognitive functions are linked to specific brain regions. So, in this case, the brain area was defined by its function, not strictly by its anatomical structure. My God. About a decade later, German neurologist Karl Wernicke, who had familiarized himself with Broca's work, described some of his patients who seemed to be in the opposite situation compared to Tang. They were unable to understand language whilst being able to speak. The speech being absolute gibberish, though, in my opinion, slightly more insightful than some of the things our world leaders have said recently. But this condition is now known as Wernicke's aphasia. Postmortem examinations of the patient's brains revealed lesions in the posterior part of the temporal lobe, so the part of the brain lobe at the back of the head, later named Wernicke's area. Wernicke used this discovery to compare his cases with the one of Broca and made conclusions about the processes related to speech taking place in the brain. First, he distinguished that speech production takes place in the posterior frontal lobe, so the Broca area, while speech comprehension happens in the posterior part of the temporal lobe, the Wernicke area. This indicated that in case of a healthy person without aphasia, there had to be a connection between the two as well. Later, this neurological bridge called arcuate fasciculus was discovered, which is basically a bundle of white matter nerve fibers which transmit information from one language center to the other. As for the process of speech comprehension and production, Wernicke proposed a three-step model. First, sensory inputs from the outside world, whether auditory or visual, is transmitted to the brain. The Wernicke area then processes these signals and identifies them as linguistic elements. The result of this analysis is then transmitted to the Broca area, where it is converted into a motor code, so something that our muscles execute that enables either articulation, with the mouth, or writing through hand movement. Another important conclusion one could draw from Wernicke's model is that if there are three components in the brain that are involved in speech, one where it's being comprehended and one where it's being produced, and one that connects these two centers, problems related to speech could also result from damage occurring in the connecting piece, so the arcuate fasciculus. And that is what we in fact call conduction aphasia. Patients with this condition often produce speech with misplaced or swapped syllables, despite intact comprehension and fluent production, as the disruption of this pathway prevents effective communication between the Broca and Wernicke areas. Further support for Broca's and Wernicke's theories came from electrical brain stimulation during neurosurgical procedures. Such stimulation provided converging evidence, so like very strong evidence, for the functional specialization of these language areas. The electrical stimulation, so the disruption of Broca's area, for example, resulted in an almost total loss of language function. Patients could only produce isolated words or names. Since then, 21st century examination techniques like functional MRI studies have confirmed a lateralization of language processing to the left hemisphere in most individuals, meaning that the Broca area is found in the left part of the brain in most people. Despite the fact that these discoveries have been leading the way for modern cognitive neurosciences, today we know that an important remark has to be made when attributing certain functions to certain brain areas. This being that brain activation does not necessarily imply a specific mental state, and a specific mental state does not always require activation in one particular area. So, difficulties in speech production are not always caused solely by damage to Broca's area, for example. Rather, it's complex networks involving multiple regions that are often implicated. An analogy for this is, for example, pain processing. So, activation in the amygdala often occurs during painful experiences, but amygdala activity alone does not necessarily mean or cause that a person is feeling pain. So, yeah, That's our first biological psychology session done, folks. How do you feel? I I feel like how my desk plant looks, uh, deranged and desperate for sunlight. It's okay, we only got 6 more months of Berlin winter to go. Um, Anyways, thank you so much for listening. Take care. Don't trust oddly attractive women you meet on suspension bridges, and we'll talk again soon. Bye bye.